Okay, let me introduce myself. My name is William Charnock. I'm the Director of Data Network Engineering for Allegiance Telecom. Presenting with me is Dave Israel. He's the Senior Manager of Backbone Engineering for our company. And we're presenting about a network consolidation project we went through in the past year. Basically, what we're going to talk about is the history behind the AS merger, what some of our business drivers were for doing this, the approach we took, why we chose to do what we did. Dave is going to discuss the preparation and the actual cut, and then we'll tie it all up with some lessons learned. So. Allegiance Telecom acquired the IBI network assets in December of 2001 from WorldCom. As part of the SEC mandate, when WorldCom bought Intermedia, they were required to sell the old DigX IBI backbone. Allegiance Telecom was, we'll refer to it as a Tier 2 network. We had a nationwide network with some peering, but we were still purchasing transit. Whereas IBI was a nationwide Tier 1 backbone, they did not purchase transit. So why would we do what we did? Basically, we wanted to gain some efficiencies in network expense by consolidation of our facilities, consolidate our operations and support, have uniform routing policies across all the networks, and have the ability to sell either network's products at any site. We had a pretty diverse set of products between the two companies. The approach we took, because we were migrating, we made a decision to go to the 2548 AS because we felt that it had some value. We had to tailor the migration to fit within the limitations of the legacy Allegiance network. And by that I mean that the IBI network was well aggregated, being that it was a little older than our network, and it would have been easier to migrate their network pop by pop, whereas we were not so well aggregated because having started in the last 5 years or so, we weren't able to get large allocations, and so we had our net blocks scattered all over the place. And it posed some issues as far as consolidation. What we had traditionally seen in some network consolidation was the integration consisted of moving the smaller AS behind the larger AS, basically making the smaller AS a transit customer of the larger AS. We viewed that as a less risky proposition and that didn't pose any real significant customer downtime. But by merging the two networks, we could accomplish all of our goals and do it in a relatively short period of time. It was obviously more risky, and it required a significant amount of downtime, but it suited our needs. So some considerations if you ever consider doing something like this. The network size, we had approximately 500 routers pre-merger. The protocols that you use on your network have to scale, and we'll get into that a little bit, but we encountered some scalability issues along the way. In a multi-vendor environment, you're going to encounter some interesting things, especially if you're using MPLS. Unfortunately, we didn't uncover it in the lab. We uncovered it once we had done the conversion, but we found some interoperability issues that were nasty. And the routing policy can be a little tricky to adapt from one platform to another, especially if you're still on a learning curve with the new router. So. And you have to ask yourself if network consolidation makes sense. Given your specific situation, it may not. We were in a unique situation in that we had a brand new nationwide network that we had just built for Allegiance prior to the IBI acquisition, and we felt that that gave us a little bit of an advantage in the consolidation phase. So I'm going to let Dave take over at this point.
So the first thing we had to look at was how we were going to do it. We had to come up with an overall strategy, obviously. what was important was to make sure that technical people understood what the business people wanted in the end. Otherwise, you end up with an integrated network that wasn't what people wanted in the first place, 8 hours of downtime that didn't accomplish anything. The second thing was to set obtainable milestones and goals. We truly tried to push it too fast at first, and fortunately we realized we were pushing it too fast before it got too out of hand. Yeah, it's nice to say we can do this in a month. I swear to God, I won't sleep. I'll come in weekends. I'll eat while I'm typing, but it's much better to actually keep your sanity. Then we had to put together the team. Team building was interesting. Allegiance is stationed in, or home office in Dallas, and we're all up in Greenville. That's a good several thousand-mile distance there. And keeping everybody on the same page was, and making sure that everybody needed to be involved was an interesting process, but we got through it. Hello. There we go. And we put together our plan. Basically we decided that neither of the old policies was going to work for us, so we had to put together a new policy, which we needed to prove the new policy worked. Lab time, lots and lots and lots of lab time. Lab time isn't always what you need. I mean, you have to see what it does in the real world. The lab can find a lot of your mistakes early. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. Key dependencies, identify risks, a couple of buzzwords. Task personnel based on core competencies, yeah. That's actually a little bit harder than it sounds, because sometimes you think somebody's best in one place and you find out that's not where they belong. Like laying out the cutover process. Everybody here thinks, I know what I'm doing. Yeah, we thought we know what we're doing. Having keystroke documentation, even if you know exactly what you're doing, is a wonderful thing, because when you're running low on time and you start to panic, and you start cutting corners, things start going wrong. You have keystroke documentation, you know exactly what you're supposed to do. You don't have to think, and McDonald's will tell you the less your employees think, the better they do. Small company, I don't remember the station. To set hard backup points, that was a big thing. We had to say, if it's not working, if this isn't working by this point, we're never going to get this done. Instead of rushing forward and blowing everything up, just put everything back the way it was, sigh, have some coffee, and try again next week. And practice, 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 practice. It doesn't matter if you're not actually doing any real work, just going through the motions over and over again will get you the feeling of, okay, this is exactly what I'm going to do that night, and hey, what would be really nice here is if we had somebody doing this. You catch a lot of mistakes by practicing. First time we tried to do it in one night. Big mistake. There was way too much. 500 routers have to be touched. One of them goes wrong, and you spend 10 minutes on fixing it, and now you're really behind. So we backed that out and went back and tried it in 2 nights. First we do the legacy IBI network, which had more routers, but was closer to the policy that we were going to, so it was less work. And then the second piece, we would reconfigure the Allegiance one. There's really 3 networks involved, but the third network didn't carry any traffic. It was a backbone we were rolling everything onto. And so that was actually a boon. If you can do that, if you ever have to merge ASs, if you can have a third network that's not doing anything, that's wonderful, because you can play on it. Of course, not everybody can afford to build another OC48 network. So the week before we did Allegiance, we did IBI. We shut down all of our external peers, so we wouldn't get death threats and car bombs. Basically, do not pay attention to what's happening behind the curtain. We'll come out when we're done. That again was a really good idea. I strongly recommend not letting anybody see what's happening in the energy of your network. Sure, customers have solid downtime instead of spotty downtime, but customers have more downtime if everybody decides they're not going to listen to your routes anymore. We found a couple small policy bugs, things that didn't behave exactly the way expected. Nothing that caused huge trauma, but good things to fix before we integrated the rest of the network. Noon, day before, we told everybody no more configuration changes. If you ever have to do this, do that. Last thing you need is to find out that somebody configured something 20 minutes ago that you have no idea how you're going to handle during the merger. New configurations are generated and sanity checked. put together a Perl script, actually, that downloaded the config, figured out what it should look like after it was done, and spat it back out. Shared that with people. People pointed out things that were vastly wrong with it, things that it had missed, things that it had gotten right. We did it again. Perl script was poorly written and still did a router every 2 seconds. If you have somebody who can script like this and you need to make a lot of configuration changes, again, I strongly recommend it. It's also less prone to typos than human beings, or if it's going to make a typo, it's going to make the same typo. Yeah, and we backed up the router configurations because really the easiest way to back out from a massive change is to put the old configuration back and reboot, which is actually how we put the configurations in the first place, just to make sure we had a clean committal. We then, like I mentioned before, shut off all the peers on both sides for the complete merger, and loaded all the configurations out in a single market. Rebooted that market, made sure it worked. It's not on the slide, but it didn't. So we had to go back and say, what did we do wrong, and do it again, because we had the script. We could regenerate those configs in a couple minutes. It took, I think, 3 tries to get it all working, but then we put the configurations on all the routers. Yeah, after those routers working, the configurations out on the rest of the took the big switch, network off, network on, market by market. The 5 minutes it takes for the worst case router to reload, and everything's working. In a couple of cases it wasn't working, but again, for the most part it worked very cleanly. Surprisingly well. We expected to lose a large number of routers to various stupidity, and it didn't happen. There was a couple of routers that were running the wrong route of code, and they did some unexpected things. But for the most part, everything just worked. A couple post-merger issues. Getting the different routers and different policies talking to each other is bad. When one thing uses this community to say don't export that, and the other one uses a different community, or the actual no export tag, they will leak routes. That's not surprising. Then different versions of the software can do completely different, same thing completely different ways, or completely different, well, not completely different, but slightly different things with the same command, and you don't expect it. So again, homogeneity is really the key here. A different software version, something you didn't expect in the lab, so you didn't try it there, can really ruin your whole night. Scalability. Not many people have 500 router test labs. A couple people do, and if you do, I'd like to go work for you.
We'll volunteer to use that lab.
Yeah. But with 500 routers, you'll find that you're testing the limits of routing protocols and transports that other people haven't tested. Just pure number of nodes can knock over or really stress test a number of protocols. And you really have to make sure, A, your policy is scaled in the first place, and B, your code is solid. Yeah, I'm not going to mention vendor names, but I guess you can guess. Sometimes they don't do things the same way. They read the same RFC. They don't look at each other, pretend the other one doesn't exist, and they put together exactly the same words, completely differently, and assume that's the other one's fault when it doesn't work when they talk to each other. When you actually sit them down and say, hey, this is broken, they worked with us, and we'll mention that later. They were really good at bringing our stuff up. But yeah, it was a surprise how many things didn't work exactly the same. Last thing I want to mention real quick here is, I think it's my last thing, is a policy gap. I don't know if anybody was peering with us when we did the merger. I'm sure there's some people here who were. Saw us announce the entire internet. It doesn't sound like success. It wasn't actually a policy gap that's kind of misleading as much as it was a customer gap. We had a customer that lost their policy when we redid the network and got stuck on the default policy, which was, hey, this is a peer, announce their stuff. So they were peering with another provider because they were multi-homed and announcing the entire internet to us because they were poorly configured. And poorly configured plus poorly configured equals really, really bad. So we had to turn that off and deal with the customer. And I'll give it back to Will for some closing comments.
Yeah, we learned a lot during this. Obviously, nobody's perfect. We didn't go into this thinking we were, but you know, typos happen. You move on with your life. We expected some equipment to fail, and sure enough, it did. Every time you reload a router, I think you're taking a big risk. We also learned that you can't plan enough. We spent several months planning this cut, and for all the testing we did, we still uncovered things that we didn't account for. And Dave specifically wanted to mention from a scalability point that some of these problems obviously don't manifest in a lab where you have, you know, half a dozen or a dozen routers. However, on a large network, they will manifest, and unfortunately they manifest in bad ways. Some of the company type lessons learned. Communication is extremely key during a process like this. We probably didn't do a good enough job of notifying our peers and customers exactly what kind of work we were doing. But I think it's key going forward that if you ever attempt something like this, that you make sure you notify your customers, give them a really good idea of what you're attempting to do, and as well as your peers. I mean, the peers are a valuable resource and a valuable asset and valuable partners. And I feel like we probably should have given a little better notice to our peers there. And also set and manage realistic expectations both to your customers and your executive management. And we also learned that an out-of-band management network is a priceless asset. Hopefully, we all learned a lot, especially about that. Also, some of the things that you should think about if you're ever planning something like this is, you know, don't be afraid to speak up. We had a lot of meetings, a lot of meetings leading up to this. And if somebody comes up with an obscure way that this could break, don't knock it down as, you know, that's too obscure, it won't ever happen. Because, you know, we just discovered a lot of things along the way. It was a hellish 2 weeks, we'll just put it that way. What we started with, these were the networks that we had going into this. We had the Allegiance network, the old IBI network, and what we call our next-gen network, which was this Virgin network that we had. And this is the finished product, or an approximation of it. This is approximately what our network looks like today. We officially, I'd say we're about, what, 95%? We've accomplished about 95% of our consolidation at this point. There's still some optimization occurring, some links going up and down, being disconnected, and new links coming up. But this is what we're done with. And I have a little personal slide at the end. I'm a long-suffering Tampa Bay Buccaneers fan. Oh, sorry. I'll get to that first. And I just want to say, go Bucks. I also want to send some thanks out to the teams that worked on this with us. This was not a two-person effort. A lot of people worked on this. I want to thank the Greenbelt team, primarily the ex-IBI Digex people, the Dallas team, and I don't usually thank vendors, but the Cisco and Juniper techs were very helpful during this, actually. They were available during the call. They were on the call while we were doing the work, and they helped us resolve some of the critical issues in a relatively short time. So that's that. Any questions? Got a couple coming.
I've always been taught that for a large operation, you just never, ever, ever do a cutover. You find some way to do incremental change, and one could argue that's what you came to, although going from one switch to two doesn't seem like much of a step. So my question is whether you think now that you've gone through this, there would have been a way to engineer this more incrementally and therefore less traumatically.
I think that if we'd had more time, then yeah, we probably could have come up with some ways to be a little more clever about it. Something we didn't mention was that we were under a timeline of about a year to have this consolidation done. So it required us to take steps that were maybe more drastic than we would have liked to have taken, but in the end we accomplished the goal, you know, with some heartache and headaches. So yeah, I would say there's probably some ways we could have thought of to do this, maybe using confederations or something like that. Again, the way that we chose suited our needs, and you know,
just add something real quick here. From a customer service point of view, I would have loved to do an incremental change. As an engineer, the first thing I thought was, my God, if we do an incremental change, we'll get halfway done and get stuck. We'll have a policy that nobody wants that doesn't do anything, and we're not allowed to change for whatever reason. So I was very split on that. But the timeline let the engineer win, which I usually prefer.
I was wondering if you could speak to the tools environment a little more. You mentioned having a Perl script to munge configurations. In the larger picture, were you changing DNS at the same time? Did you have like a big rancid router.db that you needed to change at the same time? What was going on at, one
Sure.
step away from the routers?
Sure. I'll take part of that, and then I'll hand some off to Dave. We did a lot of post-merger cleanup, and we're still doing some of that here and there. We renumbered our entire backbone. Some of the links that we kept from the Allegiance network were on different space than what we decided we wanted all of our backbone links numbered in. Loopback addresses were changed, things like that. Dave, you want to talk about the tools that were used, because you wrote them, I think. So.
Yeah. Well, yeah, the Perl script was, again, completely homegrown. Changing DNS was more of an aux-sed experiment more than anything else. Monitoring, one of the reasons why we renumbered is some of our monitoring tools discover based on network, and based on DNS, but also by network. And so by putting everything on the same network, everything automatically discovered. We did have a huge rancid database of configurations. That was where I pulled the configurations, well, half rancid, half homegrown tool, because there was two separate networks before we got started. But I pulled from those. One was polling the routers 4 times a day. The other one was polling it more often. That's part of the reason for the huge config freeze time period, though, is to make sure the monitoring tools had plenty of time to get the exact current config, make sure we weren't modifying a customer out of existence. I guess that's it.
No more questions?
Yeah, I think that's all. I had one question, but that was the one that Stephen just asked. So.
Okay.
Oh, well, okay. So thanks again very much, guys, for that talk.